Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Befiehl, deine, Wege, again, very similar to the harmonization we had yesterday with some slight differences. I would say that this chorale harmonization is slightly easier to analyze. It's a little bit more straightforward, less twists and turns, but still an equally interesting ending. So Bach clearly has had some type of fixation on what was going on at the end here with that double suspension. If you didn't check out yesterday's episode, you should check it out. That would be episode 273. Let's just hop right into the analysis. Not too many differences between this chorale and yesterday's. So two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major, we end on F sharp major, so we have this unusual half cadence at the end here, but I do think the overall tonality of the chorale is B minor, despite the fact we start in the key of D major with a 1 chord here. We then have G, G, D, and B, that's a 4 chord, G major. And then we have F sharp, A, D, and A, which is another tonic triad, but this time it is in first inversion. After our 1/6 chord, we have E, B, E, and G, which spells E minor, and we might be tempted to call it a 2 chord, but I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, and instead we're dealing with C sharp here, C sharp, E, E, and G, which would be a 7/6 chord, C sharp diminished over E. And we would expect on the next beat, if you've watched my videos in the past, or if you just know about Bach's usage of this progression, we would expect a tonic triad in root position, D major, D, D, A, and F sharp. And that's exactly what we get, 1/6-7-6-1 being one of the most common progressions in Bach, or the retrograde, 1/7-6-1-6. We then get G, D, B, and E. That's E minor 7 over G, which is 2/6-5. We know that Bach loves 2/6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. A, C sharp, A, and E. That's a 5 chord, A major in root position. And our imperfect authentic cadence concludes with a tonic triad, D, D, A, and F sharp, which is our tonic in root position. Now, this modulation right here is actually interesting because I'm going to compare it to a modulation that we're going to get next time to show, symmetry between the A section and the B section. However, right now I'm going to analyze this as a common chord modulation, but I do think there is an argument to be made, a very strong argument at that, that this modulation is direct. But it just so happens that when we're modulating to the key of B minor, this phrase also ends in a perfect authentic cadence. This D major is a common chord between them, and 3 going to some type of dominant, going to some type of, stable or usually a tonic functioning chord is a somewhat common progression. Definitely not as common as like 2 going to 5 or 4 going to 7, but 3 going to 5, definitely like a tier or 2 below it as far as frequency is concerned. So A sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and C sharp is F sharp major over A sharp, that's 5/6. And then we get B, C sharp, F sharp, and D. The C sharp, of course, being a 9/8 suspension over the bass. We know that our tonic's being implied, but in typical Bach fashion, Bach will change the bass by the time we get the resolution. This doesn't happen every time, but it happens pretty frequently. We have a passing tone in the bass. D, B, F sharp, and D is our tonic triad in first inversion, making this just a 1/6 chord. We don't need to rewrite the Roman numeral, we'll just change the figure bass. Another passing tone in the bass as well before we get F sharp, B, F sharp, and C sharp. It looks kind of like a 1/6-4 chord. This is actually another suspension. This is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and we know this is often echoed in another voice as a passing tone. It seems to be just like a relatively common embellishment or formula that Bach uses to cadence. So we have F, B, F sharp, and C sharp. That's implying a 5 chord, F sharp major. We get the resolution on the next beat, F sharp, A sharp, F sharp, and C sharp with a late passing 7th here in the alto before we cadence on B minor, B, B, D, and B, which is 3 roots and 1/3. Looking ahead to the B section, we have a plagal cadence. Interesting, in the key of D major. So we're looking for a point in which we modulate, and I'm convinced that we modulate right here at the beginning. This B minor chord, B, B, F sharp, and D, also happens to be 6 in the key of D major, with a passing 7th in the tenor, B, B, F sharp, and D. We then get E, G, G, and C sharp with the passing tone in the melody. We kind of have the inverse of what's going on here. So here the B is the accented non-chord tone, and we have a C sharp diminished chord. Here we have a C sharp diminished chord on the beat, and this B is a passing seventh. So this would be a 7/6 chord of, it would just be a 7/6 chord of nothing, because we are in the key of D major. In yesterday's chorale, we used 7/6 to go to 6, which was a deceptive take on this very typical chord progression that we find in Bach, and Bach used it to modulate to the key of B minor to cadence in the key of B minor. But here, we're seeing the retrograde of the progression we saw yesterday as well. We see this exact same progression in yesterday's chorale as well, 6, 7, 6, and we would expect 1, 6 on the other side of this because it's passing upwards F sharp, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 1/6 chord, D major over F sharp. We have some passing tones in the inner voices here, which gives us F sharp, C sharp, E, and A, which is like a passing F sharp minor 7 chord, but I don't really think that contributes too much to the progression because really this C is sharp, I kind of view it more as a passing seventh, and this E is sort of just an accessory to that, and 1 and 3 are already very similar to one another, so it doesn't really feel like a subdivided progression in the same way that other chord progressions could potentially feel with this double passing tone going on in the inner voices. But afterwards we get G, B, D, and B, which is G major in root position. It's our 4 chord, passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the tenor as well, kind of doubling up on what just happened on the previous beat. And then we get E, G, G, and C sharp. Again, here we have another C sharp diminished chord over E, that's 7/6. Of course, you could look at this A as the chord tone as well, A, E, G, and C sharp, which would be A7 over E. So I suppose you could also analyze this as 5/4/3, but 7/6 versus 5/4/3, it's really 6 of one, half dozen of another. They're pretty much the same chord, and they function the same way too, so it doesn't really matter. And 4 wants to really go to either of them. And then we have D, B, G, and D, which is G major in second inversion. Sorry, I had to orient myself there, which is a 4/6/4 chord. And after our 4/6/4 chord, we get D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad D major, with a couple of neighbor tones going on here in the inner voices as well. We've seen this type of plagal cadence in the past. It's relatively uncommon, but I guess common amongst plagal cadences. So the chord that we have on the actual end of the phrase is another tonic triad, D, A, F sharp, and D. So the cadence, I guess, from the harmonic standpoint ends here, but the phrase ends here because the chord is redundant. Okay, looking ahead, we have a phrase that ends in a half cadence. It's in the key of E minor, and we're looking for a point on which we modulate between the two keys. So we have D, D, F sharp, and A to start the phrase off. That's D major in root position. And then we have G, D, G, and B, which is a 4 chord, G major in root position. And I think this is a modulation zone because we're looking at 2 chords here that are diatonic to both the key of D major and the key of E minor. You could say that this is a 7 chord in the key of E minor. You could say that this is a 3 chord in the key of E minor. I chose to modulate over the G major chord and call it 3 in the key of E minor. But like I said, I think either point could be an accurate place to analyze. It depends on where you hear it and depends on what makes sense to you. We have a passing seventh in the bass, and then we have E, C, F sharp, and A. This could potentially be an F sharp minor 7 flat 5 chord over E, but I do think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and this is D sharp, C, F sharp, and A. Yeah, D sharp, C, F sharp, and A, which is D sharp diminished 7th. It's fully diminished. And that would be a 7 chord, 3 going to 7. That's some transitive harmony. We would expect 7 to go to 3, but here we see 3 going to 7. We've actually seen this figure recently. If this D major chord were 7 in the key of E minor, which it could be analyzed as, 7 subtonic, which would be our flat 7 chord, 3, and then we get the diminished 7 chord, which is a leading tone 7 chord on the other side of it. We've seen that progression before. It's kind of interesting. And then afterwards we have E, B, F sharp, and G, We saw this similar thing earlier where we went from a dominant chord to a tonic chord where the third, in this case it's the third of the chord. Here it's the fifth of the chord that's being held over and turned into a suspension that turns into this figure here where we know a tonic triad is being implied, E, B, F sharp, and G. The resolution happens on the next beat, but by the time we get to the next beat, the bass has changed. We have a passing tone on the bass, and here we have G, B, E, and G, which is E minor over G, which is a 1/6 chord, just like we had here. This time, however, we get this E on the and of 4, E, B, E, and G, which is like taking the chord and putting it in root position. I always think it's interesting when we have an entirely intact chord as a byproduct of Bach skipping a third down in one of the voices. A lot of the times we don't have the entire chord left over by the time Bach removes one of the voices or replaces one of the voices, but in this case he's doubled the third, so adding a root in there is not impactful in terms of taking away anything from the structure of the chord. But being a half cadence, this phrase ends on a 5 chord, B, B, D sharp, and F sharp. That's B major in root position. Notice how we have the fifth of the chord in the melody as well. It's typically a hallmark of half cadences with Bach. The majority of them have that. Not all of them, but the majority. And then we're looking ahead to our next phrase, which ends in the key of A major. Actually, the whole phrase is in the key of A major, and this is where I wanted to draw a point of comparison, both for yesterday's chorale and today's chorale. Yesterday's chorale, a little less so, but here we have this half-step movement here in the bass, G sharp going to A as opposed to A sharp going to B here. I called this a common chord modulation because it just so happens that D major is also a chord in the key of B minor, and we see this 3-5-1 progression occasionally, especially at the beginning of phrases, because it just so happens that the chord is common in most of those cases. But here, B major is not diatonic to the key of A major, so I have to analyze this as a direct modulation. But because the way that the phrases look very similar to each other at the beginning with this half-step motion, perhaps these are both direct modulations. So maybe this is a direct modulation, who knows. I think they're both accurate analyses. I'm actually kind of convinced now that this might be a direct modulation, but whether you analyze it as a common chord modulation or a direct modulation, it really doesn't matter too much in this case. I think they're both valid options. Here is definitely a direct modulation because we're, just like in yesterday's chorale, juxtaposing the idea of E major and E minor in close proximity to one another. This happens to be an E7 chord over G sharp, which would be 5-6-5, G sharp, B, E, and D, and that resolves to A major, A, E, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad in root position. We have passing tones in the melody and the tenor, and then we get another A major chord, A, C sharp, A, and E. No need to reanalyze. Passing seventh in the alto, and then we get B, D, F sharp, and D. Like earlier, we could call this a 2 chord B minor, but I think, oh, sorry, I marked that under the wrong chord. We could call this chord B minor, but I think it's actually more likely that this is a G sharp diminished chord, G sharp, B, and D. It's a 7-6 chord, just like we saw earlier, like 1-6-7-6-1, or in this case, like I mentioned earlier, it's just as common to see Bach use the other direction, 1-7-6-1-6, C sharp, E, A, and C sharp, which is in fact our 1-6 chord. So it's pretty cool that we see that progression very consistently, and I don't even think that that's the last time we're going to see this progression. We'll probably see it again. We then get D, F sharp, A, and B, which is B minor 7 over D, which is 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. Very similar phrase, sort of, to our first phrase, actually, cadentially. But then afterwards we get, like we would expect, a 5 chord, E, E, G sharp, and B. That's E major in root position. And then we cadence on A major, A, E, A, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad in root position. Alright, looking ahead to probably the most interesting phrase in the chorale, ends in a half cadence in the key of B minor, but we start the phrase in the key of D major. And in the case of phrases that turn into like the tonic key, I guess you could make an argument that this
piece is in the key of D major. After all, it spends more time in D major than it does in B minor, but I do think the fact that we end in B minor has a heftier weight in terms of the overall tonality of the chorale than the proportion of how much time we spend in D major. But often cadencing in the key of the dominant usually leads to it being the dominant in the key of the tonic, and that's exactly what's going on here. So in the key of D major, this is now our 5 chord, and then we get D major, D, D, A, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad and root position, passing 7th in the bass, and we're looking for a point that we modulate to the key of B minor. E, B, E, and G. We could analyze this again as a 2 chord, but I do think that this is a C sharp diminished chord over E, which is 7-6. It's just so coincidental that this is like the case with pretty much every progression that's like this in Bach, so that's why I read into it and say that you could analyze it as 2, you could analyze it as 7-6. To me, 7-6 makes more sense because that typically wants to resolve to a tonic triad, but there's really no reason why 2 can't either. It's just not as strong of a progression because it doesn't have the leading tone in it. That's just my opinion, but it doesn't really matter. Like I said, 7 versus 2, they're basically the same chord. One has the leading tone and one doesn't. But afterwards we have F sharp, D, A, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Again, another tonic triad, 7-6, 1-6 progression. We have passing tones in the lower voices here. It's kind of like a passing 4-7 chord, G, D, B, and F sharp. And I'll go ahead and mark that, why not? Because we do have a 5 chord on the next beat, A, C sharp, and E, which is A major. And 1 can go to 5 totally fine. 4 also wants to go to 5, which makes me feel like this is a little bit more consequential than other 2-voice subdivided progressions. Here we have G, B, D, and E, which is kind of like a passing 2-6-5 chord actually, which makes me feel like there's a little bit of a turnaround going on here. We could also say this is the point in which we modulate to the key of B minor, but I don't think that's likely because we have an A natural here in the melody, and we would be looking for that A sharp or something more indicative of B minor by the time we got to this point if we were to modulate over the end of a beat. And also, modulating over the end of a beat is relatively uncommon. We seldom see it, and I feel like there needs to be, like I was just talking about earlier, something a little bit more justified to make that the case. But I do think we have 2-6-5 going to 3 here, F sharp, C sharp, E, and A. But with the counterpoint, take that with a grain of salt because all the voices are really doing their own thing at this point, and it is sometimes difficult to pick out exact chords and what are being implied. You know, the inner voices are really just preparing something that's going on in the future, and if there's a chord happening around it, it very well may just be incidental. But yeah, I do think there might be a 3-7 chord here, or E, C sharp, E, and G. It's quite possible that we have some type of 7 chord going on here as well, but I'm going to mark this as a 3-7 chord. And the reason why I feel like there might be a 3-7 chord going on here is because of what we already know from yesterday's analysis about what happens on the downbeat of the final measure. We have D, C sharp, E, and F sharp, very similar to the ending that we had yesterday. I do think we have, again, another double suspension here. The C sharp wants to resolve down to B, the E wants to resolve down to D. So what effectively is happening is we are alluding to a B minor chord here in first inversion, which would be a 6-6 chord in the key of D major. So 3 going to 6 is a good idea. It's a good look because it's a normative progression, follows the cycle of falling fifths, and also happens to be our tonic in first inversion in the key of B minor. This F sharp, C sharp, and F sharp, we had a fully voiced 5 chord by this point in yesterday's chorale, but this, from a harmonic standpoint, is a little bit sparser in terms of what we can analyze because we have D, F sharp, C sharp, and F sharp, which would be an incomplete D major 7 chord, which I don't think is as important to the chord progression because really I think what's being implied here is more dominance, right? The F sharp and the C sharp and the F sharp being held here in the melody seem to be more impactful as outlining the chords to come rather than implying some D major chord that's happening in passing. So it's about context, and that comes from experience. So if you're analyzing along with me and that's not entirely clear, it's totally fine. But yes, afterwards we have this C sharp, D, F sharp, and F sharp here, but I think this C sharp is an accented non-chord tone, and what we're really dealing with is B minor, B, B, D, and F sharp, but this time it's in root position, so we're going from 1-6 to 5-3 here, which is just saying root position. Similar to what's going on here, we have 1 and then 1-6. I view that what's happening here just like that, but the retrograde, where we have 1-6 going to root position. Of course, it's not happening with the same figure in the bass, but there are other factors contributing to why I believe we're just dealing with a big B minor chord here with some dominant action woven in. And of course our final chord is F sharp major, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad and root position. It's very interesting that Bach chooses to half cadence with the root of the chord in the melody again, which is, it's interesting that he does that. Maybe there's even this idea of us being in the key of F sharp minor, and this is actually a plagal cadence. That's something that never really even dawned on me, but I feel like if we were in the key of F sharp minor, there would need to be some E sharp action going on, and it just makes more sense that this is a half cadence. It also sounds more like a half cadence, so it would really take a lot of brainwashing for me to feel like legitimize the idea of it being a plagal cadence in the key of F sharp minor, but on paper, you could make the argument. In context, don't really think that's what's going on. But some takeaways for today's chorale: plagal cadence, which is very interesting. It's not really a juxtaposition, but the comparison between the beginning of the second phrase and the beginning of the fifth phrase, if you're not including the repeats. The seventh phrase, if you include the repeat. The fifth phrase, if you're just looking at the score. Are these both direct modulations? I'm thinking yes, they're probably both direct modulations. It just so happens that one has a common chord before it, if you technically want to reason it that way. But all in all, it doesn't really matter too much. I just see a similarity between both of them, and I think that creates symmetry between the two phrases as far as their profiles are concerned. And of course, the ending with the double suspension, that's something that is relatively unusual, and makes me curious as to whether or not I've missed any double suspensions in my previous analyses. I don't feel like I have, but it is very interesting when we get a cadence that has this kind of profile, or really, if this were to happen at any point in the chorale, it would have been interesting, but I would have reckoned that this would happen in a cadential situation because it is uniquely contrapuntal in the grand scheme of things. But with all that being said, I think that is today's analysis, or really all that I want to say about today's analysis. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon as well if you want to be notified of my daily upload, and hit the like button so that more people can see the content. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.